Antarctica has to be one of the most mysterious places on Earth. After hearing all the ancient accounts, geological evidence, and other weird things going on in Antarctica right now, you might wonder, is it about to get even stranger? Could it have been the home of Atlantis, the famous lost continent? You guys can decide on this one, so let me know your theories in the comment section below. Let's start by asking, when was Atlantis destroyed, and when did it disappear beneath the sea? Plato wrote about Solon's visit to Egypt in 500 BCE. He said that Atlantis had sunk beneath the sea approximately 9,000 years previously, leading us back to 9500 BCE. Others rounded off to 10,000 BCE. What did Atlantis look like? It was a circular island continent with a huge mountain range in the center and the world's largest natural harbor. Antarctica is also a round island continent with a huge mountain range, elevated to around 9,000 feet at its center. The world's largest natural harbor could easily be the Ross Sea, a deep bay in Antarctica's southern ocean. Where was Atlantis? The island continent was said to be located at a latitude that would give it a mild Mediterranean climate for most of the year. If the polar axis were located in a different place, depending upon where Antarctica would be found, it could undoubtedly have had periods of excellent climate. To reach Atlantis from Egypt, one had to sail out the Pillars of Hercules, that is, the Straits of Gibraltar. Note that the Suez Canal is a modern achievement. There was no maritime passage from the Mediterranean to the Red Ross in bygone days. To reach Antarctica from Egypt in days when there was no Suez Canal, one would have had to sail out the Straits of Gibraltar and head southward towards the modern Middle and South Atlantic Oceans, assuming that polar ice did not obstruct one's passage. These three crucial descriptive points made by Plato about Atlantis can lead us to assume that an unfrozen Antarctica located at a Mediterranean-like northern latitude could have been the Atlantis' legendary paradise. Certain other writers mention this most logical identification, but because of the mystical antiquity of the whole idea, most people don't pay much attention to it. It has become just another mythical bygone era of heroes and villains. For the record, it is not the place here to speculate about the advanced technology of Atlantis and its possible connections to outer space. Plato mentioned nothing about such advanced technology. Those ideas were channeled later by people like Edgar Cayce and do not belong in historical or scientific discussions of this nature. The theory of polar axial displacement is complicated because many details have to be considered and coordinated. The following hypothesis is a summary of part, albeit the most critical part, of the overall theory. There is evidence of an ice age in South Africa and Hawaii. Traditional science assumes that the current north and south polar ice zones expanded towards the equator. Traditionalists would conclude that the ice age in South Africa resulted from South Polar expansion and that of Hawaii of North Pole expansion. There are all sorts of internal contradictions amongst the various establishment theories of ice ages. Dr. Immanuel Velikovsky has adequately documented this. These currently ice-free areas like South Africa, where there is evidence of an ice age, were merely under a different polar ice cap at a different epoch of geological time. If you consult the world globe, you'll have a better understanding of this theory. If the cause of such polar axis shifts is a periodic cataclysm, then these catastrophes seem to repeat in cycles of roughly 3,600 to 4,000 years. The last one occurred in 1587 BCE, the traditional date for the Centaurian cataclysm, and the Velikonskian date for the Exodus catastrophe. The previous arrival occurred in the year 5187 BCE, which can be coordinated with the floods of Noah, Utanifism, and Deucalion. And going back another 4,000 years before that takes us back to 9187 BC. Undoubtedly, the destruction of Atlantis, as recounted by Plato, coincided with that particular cataclysm. The calculated date here is not identical to Plato's date, but since no known periodic event causes these catastrophes, the conclusion is not far-fetched that the Atlantis cataclysm coincided with the 9187 events. It must be noted that Dr. Velikovsky did not believe in Plato's literal date for Atlantis' time frame. He concluded that Plato meant 900 years, not 9,000 years ago, and that the destruction of Santorini, Thera, around 1600 BCE, gave rise to Atlantis' legend. This was picked up later by Jacques Cousteau, and it has become the establishment retort to the antiquity date explicitly stated by Plato. Assume that the North Pole was once located near Johannesburg. South Africa, and that the South Pole was located northeast of the Hawaiian Islands. This would completely reverse the north, south, and east-west directions concerning Egypt and the Great Pyramid. All of Africa would be a landmass stretching north from Egypt towards the Johannesburg Pole, much like North America stretches northwards today to the Arctic. The Pillars of Hercules, or Straits of Gibraltar, would have been east, not west, of Egypt, and Greece, which would have been due south, not north of Egypt, and more importantly, the South Africa polar zones would not have obstructed maritime travel between the Mediterranean and the then unfrozen Atlantis. It would have been located in the northern hemisphere at about the same latitudes as modern Australia is located south of the equator. However, it would have been twice as large as Australia. It would have also had an excellent Mediterranean-style climate and have been in total command of all the world's major sea routes. This was before 9187 BCE. Then, poles shifted. The North Pole moved from South Africa out into the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, stretching from West Africa to northeastern Brazil, both of which contain evidence of an ice age. As a result of this shift of the polar axis, there was now North Pole ice spanning the middle Atlantic Ocean, blocking all maritime traffic between the Mediterranean and Antarctica Atlantis via the Pillars of Hercules. Atlantis disappeared or sank beneath the sea. Contact between Egypt and Atlantis was ended permanently. Only the legend remained, handed down for thousands of years from priest to priest until finally Plato recorded it for posterity. With that introduction, here is the abstract from a lecture given by Flavio Barberio at a June 1999 Catus Frism conference at the University of Bergamo in Italy. Barberio lectured on the identification of Atlantis with Antarctica. This abstract was included in the September 2000 edition, Volume 5, Number 1, of the Velikovskian Journal published by Charles Genthenthal. It was titled, Was Atlantis in Antarctica? Arguments in Favor, by Flavio Barberio. Quote, all over the world, there exist myths about a universal flood and traditions about an antediluvian civilization called Atlantis, or Mu. Scientists usually deny any validity to such practices or reduce their significance, bringing them to more manageable spatial and temporal dimensions from an archaeological point of view. In fact, geography and archaeology do not allow any space on Earth for an advanced civilization of the size and the antiquity of Atlantis, as Plato described. End quote. This attitude does not take into account the climatic situation on Earth during the concerned period. According to Flavio Barbero, the climate conditions during the Pleistocene was influenced by the fact that the North Pole was located between Greenland and Canada at the edge of the Great Wisconsin Ice Cap. Consequently, the South Pole was placed near the current magnetic pole on Antarctica's coast, facing Australia. Therefore, Antarctica's coast facing the Atlantic was placed at a much lower latitude and was completely free of ice, as witnessed by conclusive geological evidence. The Atlantic coast of modern Antarctica contains evidence of deglaciation, which is just what one might expect. Dr. Velikovsky contended that the previous North Polar zone was centered between Greenland and Canada. Thus, this is a Velikovskian idea. However, some other researchers suggest the last North Pole may have been located a few hundred miles south of Greenland, more into the North Atlantic. Nevertheless, the previous North Pole was located further southwards into the Atlantic than today, in the direction of the former North Poles, which were found in the middle South Atlantic Ocean in South Africa. While the Paleolithic cultures were thriving all over the remaining parts of the world, the first human agricultural civilization developed in Antarctica in complete isolation, thanks to populations driven by oceanic currents from Southeast Asia and South America. At the end of the Pleistocene, an asteroid or a comet impact triggered the polar shifts. This resulted in the worldwide catastrophe remembered by traditions as the Universal Flood, during which Atlantis temporarily sank in the ocean. Soon after, the glaciation covered the Atlantic coast of Antarctica, thus deleting all archaeological evidence. From this statement, one can immediately note that writers such as Dr. Velikovsky considered these occurrences as random events, such as an errant asteroid or comet. Thus, they are forced to discuss them in isolation from each other and arrive at possible wrong conclusions. Several vessels must have survived the catastrophe, bringing their crew safely to the coast of America, Africa, and Asia. Here they restarted, in complete autonomy and isolation. Are the numerous striking similarities between ancient civilizations worldwide due to the common culture of the flood survivors? An impressive amount of evidence of different kinds supports this theory. Of course, Ignatius Donnelly in Atlantis, the antediluvian world, mentioned all of these similarities. They are the cornerstone of modern Atlantology. The chronological gap of 4 millennia between the end of Atlantis and the archaeological findings of the most ancient known civilizations is only apparent due to the thawing of the northern hemisphere ice cap. The sea level has been continuously rising during the first 4 millennia after the end of the Pleistocene for a total amount of possibly 130 meters, thus submerging any remnants of populations establishing along the coasts. This is confirmed by submerged structures worldwide, like the ruins of Yonugi Island, the remnants of a town off the Cadiz coast, etc. The following information was taken from an article by the late British Atlantologist Dr. Egerton Sykes that appeared in the Atlantis magazine in September 1973. Quote, Bimini Andros and the North Sea have facets of the megalithic culture, which lasted until BC 1500 and may well have started in 10,000 BC in Atlantis. The ruins that have been able to find are on the European and American continental shelves that endured until BC 6000. This is when the Atlantic broke through into the Mediterranean and then into the North Sea near another lost land known as Lenosis, then that finally into the Caribbean and the surrounding islands of Bimini and Andros. The cause was probably the melting of glacial ice sheets in the north, the same as that which forced the Thalassic people to leave Central Asia. There were polar axis shifts with accompanying melting polar ice caps in 1587, 5187, and 9187 BC. The fact that the megalithic culture lasted until about 1500 BC could reflect the axis shift of 1587 and the date for the Atlantic breaking through into the Mediterranean, along with other contemporary events that most certainly could be more accurately dated 5187 BCE rather than closer to 6000 BCE. In the book Atlantis Rising by Brad Steiger in 1973, we find these observations. Quote, in the January 1969 issue of Fate magazine, Hugh Auchincloss Brown reports on the evidence that indicates that Pozzuoli's Temple of Serapis on the Adriatic Sea Gulf of Venice was erected by artisans of a civilization that existed 12,000 to 19,000 years ago. Brown writes that the temple must have been erected when the site was above sea level, as it is at present, but judging by the holes left by boring claims 15 to 20 feet above the present sea level, it must have been below sea level by at least 20 feet at some point. The creators of the great marble columns had tools that enabled their artistry to rival the Egyptians, according to Brown. The present location of Pozzuoli is approximately 46 degrees north latitude, but at the time the temple was erected, its latitude was 40 degrees. The Earth did a roll-around, which was caused by the eccentric rotating mass of ice at the North Pole, and Pozzuoli moved to approximately 65 degrees north latitude, at which time the temple was submerged. These conclusions of Mr. Brown confirmed Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky's placement of the previous North Polar zones in the North Atlantic Ocean and the zone before that in the upper South Atlantic Ocean. Suppose the Temple of Serapis was constructed when its present geological location was about 40 degrees north latitude. In that case, it must have been erected when the North Pole was located between Nigeria and Brazil. At that time, the Gulf of Venice was situated at about 35 degrees north latitude, rather than its present latitude of 46 degrees north. Then, following the polar axis shift of 5187 BCE, the site of the Temple of Serapis in the Gulf of Venice not only would have most likely been submerged, but also would have been located at about 55 degrees north latitude. Thus, when the North Pole was positioned between Spain and Quebec, south of Greenland, from 5187 to 1587 BCE, the Mediterranean sea level must have been at least 20 feet higher than its present level. This would also help explain recent enigmas discovered in the Black Sea. Finally, following the polar axis shift of 1587 BCE, the sea level decreased and exposed the Temple of Serapis once again, now located at its current latitude. Finally, there is additional miscellaneous information taken from the book We Are Not the First by Andrew Thomas in 1971. On pages 74 to 76, this information is included, here for the record. Quote, the people of antiquity believed in the tremendous ages of the world and humanity, which they estimated in tens of thousands and even millions of years. To the European of Napoleonic times, the earth and man were created by God only 7,000 years ago. However, the Asiatics had different views. The Brahmins of India calculated the duration of the universe, or the day of Brahma, to be 4.32 billion years. The Druses of Lebanon set the beginning of creation at 3.43 billion years. The present age of the Earth is considered to be about 4.6 billion years, whereas that of the crust is 3.3 billion years. There are strange parallels between these figures. What is extraordinary is the pundits' time reckoning in milliards of years, cosmic chronology of this type was unknown until this century. According to Simplicius, in the 6th century AD, ancient Egyptians kept records of astronomical observations for 630,000 years. The archives of Babylon were 470,000 years old, wrote Cicero. Hipparchus in 150 BC mentioned Assyrian chronicles stretching back for 270,000 years. The Egyptian priest Solon told Herodotus in the 5th century BC that the sun had not always risen where it rose now. This implied that they kept records of the precession of equinoxes covering at least 26,000 years. The Greek historian Dionysius Laertius of the 3rd century AD claimed that Egyptian priests' astronomical records began in 49,219 BC. He also referred to their registers of 373 solar and 832 lunar eclipses, which would involve approximately 10,000 years. The Byzantine historian George Syncellus said that the Pharaoh's chronicles had recorded all events for 36,525 years. Maratinus Capello wrote in the 5th century AD that the Egyptian sages had secretly studied astronomy for over 40,000 years before they imparted their knowledge to the world. After the deluge, the first dynasty was traced by Babylonian priests to date 24,150 years before their time. According to Codex Vaticanus, A. 3738, the Mayas had kept their calendarical system since 18,612 BC. Herodotus places Osiris's reign at about 15,500 BC from the information given to him by Egypt's priests. He remarked that they were quite sure about the exactitude of the date. The lunar calendar of Babylon and the solar calendar of Egypt coincided in the year 11,542 BC. The calendrical computations of India began with the year 11,652 BC. According to Plato, the Egyptian priests fixed the date of Atlantis sinking at 9,850 BC. The Zoroastrian book set the beginning of time at 9,600 BC. That these dates are correct can be questioned, but we cannot escape the conclusion that the ancients were much closer to the truth than the scholars and clerics of 1.5 centuries ago who thought that the world had been created in 4004 BC. The universe of the Brahms was almost as old as that of modern science. The chronicles of the Mayas, the Egyptians, and the Babylonians went further back in time than our history because of what our science has yet to learn. It would be silly to accuse them of exaggeration. The mental horizon of the people of antiquity were vast, and we are only beginning to see today what they perceived yesterday. The priests of Babylon and Egypt believed that man was civilized 500,000 years ago. They kept historical and astronomical records in their archives, as Simplicius and Cicero tell us. We can smile at these claims and give civilizations 5,000 years to progress from the chariot to the automobile, from bows and arrows to the atomic bomb, from the boat to the spaceship." Unquote. Since 1973, the Ancient Mediterranean Research Association founder and director Professor Maxine Klein Asher and co-founder Professor Julian Nava launched an expedition to Spain to prove the discovery of the lost Atlantis. Accompanied by Spanish undersea diver Francisco Paco Solares Cesaro, she traveled with a university group to Cadiz, Paco. She reported later took some underwater photos of some so-called Atlantean artifacts, but they were diving and exploring too close to a naval facility and supposedly chased out of Spain. Fearing for their lives, they sought refuge in Ireland. In New York City, Professor Asher gave a press conference and had stories written in Time, Newsweek, U.S. News, and World Report, and various newspapers like the Dallas Morning News. Paco's pictures were blurry, black and white images of a couple of ancient vases, supposedly on the bottom of the ocean. Those was no size frame of reference for anything, and no people were in those pictures. But other than those pictures and her account of events as she chronicled in her book, The Atlantis Conspiracy, over the years Dr. Asher has produced no evidence of Atlantis being in Spain. Dr. David Zink wrote a book titled The Stones of Atlantis, described his research concerning the Bimini blocks and linking Atlantis to legends of Pleiadian gods, which are prevalent in Central and South America. Another undersea explorer named J. Mason Valentine conducted similar research from his base in Miami. Let us look at 15 ancient writings about Atlantis. Plato wrote a detailed account of Atlantis with its location, later history, culture, and destruction. 2. Ancient writings from the Aztecs and Mayans like the Chilean Balam, Dresden Codex, Popol Vuh, Codex Costianus, and Trano manuscript were also translated into histories of the destruction of Atlantis and Lemuria. Number 3. The Oera Linda book from Holland is said to be one of the oldest books ever found. Adela tells of the destruction of the massive Atlantic island by quakes and waves. Number 4. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus wrote that thousands of years earlier, Phoenicians had been to the vast Atlantic island. Note that Phoenician hieroglyphics have been found on numerous ruins in the South American jungles that are so ancient that the Indian tribes nearby lost memory of who built these ruins. Diodorus wrote that the Atlanteans had warred with the Amazonians. Number 5. The Greek cantor reported visiting Egypt, where they saw a marble column carved with hieroglyphics about Atlantis. Number 6. Highly respected Greek historian Ammianus Marcellius wrote about the destruction of Atlantis. Number 7. In 450 A.D., Perculus visited the islands off Africa, either the Canaries or the Azores, where the natives told him of Atlantis' destruction. Number 8. Plutarch wrote about the lost continent in the book Lives. Number 9. Herodotus, regarded by some of the greatest historian of the ancients, wrote about the mysterious island civilization in the Atlantic. The Dr. Asher expedition found just that. Number 10. The Greek historian Timagenes wrote of the war between Atlantis and Europe and explained how tribes in ancient France thought that was their original home. Note that precise, bright paintings in caves in France clearly show people wearing 20th century clothing. One image led to an underground pyramid complex. French historian and archaeologist Robert Charot dated them at 15,000 BC. Number 11. Claudius Aelianus referred to Atlantis in the 3rd century work The Nature of Animals. Number 12. Greek historian Theopompus wrote of the vast size of Atlantis and its cities of Mechamum and Eusebius, and a golden age free from disease and manual labor. Number 13. James Churchward wrote several volumes of books documenting ancient writings he claims to have translated in Southeast Asia concerning Atlantis and Mu. In contrast, geologist William Niven claimed to have excavated identical tablets in Mexico. Number 14. Dr. George Hunt Williamson, who authored several books on the Atlantean Lemurian research in the 1950s, was an anthropologist explorer who listed in Who's Who in America. Williamson wrote how descendants of the Incas led him to an ancient manuscript in a temple in the Andes Mountains that told of the destruction of Atlantis and Mu, which had advanced technology, by quakes and waves. Williamson also visited dozens of Indian tribes in the United States and Mexico that told him of Atlantis and Mu, including the Hopi Indians. Number 15. Tablet from Lhasa, Tibet, and also from Easter Island make it clear that ancients knew about Atlantis. From these ancient writings, it is clear that Atlantis' belief was common and accepted in Greece, Egypt, and the Mayans and Aztec empires. The Basques of Spain, the Gauls of France, the tribes of the Canary and Azores Islands, a tribe in Holland, and dozens of Indian tribes all speak of their origin in a large lost and sunken Atlantic land. In the mid-60s, Charles Hopgood, professor of the history of science at Keene University in New Hampshire, USA, became convinced that humanity enjoyed a sophisticated civilization 100,000 years or more ago, and that it must have been at least partly in a polar location. He derived his theory from catastrophic research conducted on ancient portolans, or nautical maps, one of which had been owned by 16th century Turkish admiral Piri Reis. This map, and others also research, clearly show that the polar regions had been cartographically surveyed where no ice cap existed, and that in the case of the Antarctic Circle, rivers and mountains had been mapped in such detail that the land must have been inhabited, and by people who understood spherical trigonometry. Charles Hapgood summed up his findings as follows. It becomes clear that ancient voyagers traveled from pole to pole. Unbelievable as it may appear, the evidence nevertheless indicates that some ancient people explored Antarctica when its coasts were free of ice. The evidence presented by the ancient maps appears to suggest existence in remote times before the rise of any of the known cultures, of a genuine civilization of a comparatively advanced sort, which either was localized in one area but had worldwide commerce, or was, in a real sense, a worldwide culture. Between the 5th and 10th millennia BC, there was a civilization on Earth that possessed excellent knowledge on navigation, cartography, and astronomy, which was no less advanced than that of the 18th century. This civilization preceded our civilization, and it was not an extraterrestrial one. Its age could be several thousand years, while its location was probably on the northern shore of the most southern continent, or archipelago, Antarctica. Later, the civilization may have resettled to the northeast of Africa. Possible recent Atlantis in Antarctica evidence. Recently, scientists have discovered a gigantic structure buried beneath the ice and snow in Antarctica. In January of 2019, pictures emerged of a possible pyramid coming out of the ice. If it is a pyramid, its size is colossal. A dome-shaped building or object has been reported being found under the ice. Satellite images have revealed what some researchers claim to be a massive staircase leading up the side of a vast mountain in Antarctica. Stumps of ancient trees and some fossilized impressions of leaves have been uncovered, proving Antarctica was not always covered in ice. In 2006, NASA satellites detected a vast and unusual gravity anomaly deep underneath Antarctica's ice. It's about 200 miles across. This was found in a part of Antarctica called Wilkes Land. Many people have noticed massive signal anomalies on the Mimic map that appear to be coming from Antarctica. What's concerning about this is they're usually directed towards an area with hurricanes, and they are noticeably strengthened while the signal passes them. Very few people have ever been able to see this area. Even the satellite images are either whited or blacked out. The reason they generally give for this is that the satellites cannot fly directly over the poles because of the magnetism. The only problem with this is the true magnetic south is no longer anywhere near the blacked out areas. And remember, all the world leaders and famous people who have made quiet visits to Antarctica. Interestingly, the Russian Orthodox Church heads and the Roman Catholic Church have not met in nearly 1,000 years. Now they meet, and Patriarch then Kirill goes to Antarctica. Coincidentally, this all happened right after Russia transported what's believed to be the Ark of Gabriel to Antarctica. The list above gives quite a few good examples of how Antarctica is becoming more critical in the search for Atlantis. Antarctica was mostly ice-free. The fossilized samples of leaves and the tree stumps that were found show that Antarctica was warm. People could have lived there and become advanced. In fact, as with all recent discoveries under the ice, it's starting to look more and more like there was once a civilization living in Antarctica. In the next few years, I believe that more evidence of an ancient civilization buried beneath all the snow will become revealed, and we will finally have proof of Atlantis. The reason for the end of this civilization was the covering of Antarctica with glaciers. It cannot be excluded that there was also large-scale floods, which were regular and caused long-term local deluges. Archaeologists confirm this. These disasters could have destroyed most of the civilization's cultural objects. However, some fragments might be found in the future under the thickness of the ice. It can also be assumed that Antarctica's survivors kept and handed down knowledge to the ancient Egyptians. Over the past 100 years or so, the ocean floor has been so thoroughly mapped that we can say with reasonable certainty that Atlantis is not on the ocean floor. Jane Francis of the University of Leeds once said, "We take it for granted that Antarctica has always been a frozen wilderness, but the ice caps only appeared relatively recently in geological history. At present, most of Antarctica is covered in a kilometer of thick ice. That means that all the ancient civilization's artifacts made in the time Antarctica was a green continent are now entombed underneath the massive ice." Author Rand Flemeth, who, along with his wife Rose, provided a good resource for this theory in their revised book. When the Sky Fell, building on the evidence assembled for Atlantis in the 2000 book, The Atlantis Blueprint, which was co-authored with Colin Wilson, Rand revisits the hypothesis of Atlantis being in Antarctica and presents overwhelming data on his lost chapter in human history. Years of fresh research continue to adventures started in the original classic, including the exploration of recent scientific breakthroughs that have turned traditional models upside down and support the case for the existence of a forgotten advanced civilization. The importance of this issue to our time is the understanding that it may shed some light on the origins of today's civilizations. There may well have been a highly advanced civilization on Earth more than 12,000 years ago. The survivors of that early civilization may have contributed to civilization as we know it today. The Atlanteans were much more advanced than their followers. The modern civilization were a precedent to the long-lost civilization called Atlantis, and the evidence is hidden in Antarctica's thick ice. If that's not enough, wait until you hear all the unusual things that are happening in Antarctica right now.